Ukrainian forces have reportedly begun the withdrawal from the city of Pokrovsk and Milnerad, where the Ukrainian forces, following the Russian capture of the E50 highway, has decided to withdraw from these two cities, with only one supply line remaining under their control, which is constantly under Russian threat of capture, which means that there is a risk of complete encirclement. The last time the Ukrainians started withdrawing from a city of similar size to that of Pokrovsk was the city of Avdiivka, where the Russians captured the city in its entirety only 10 days after the beginning of the withdrawal. Therefore, we might just be a couple of weeks from the Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, especially with the pressure on Rudinsky increasing, where they almost have full control over the city on the northern flank of Mirnorod and Pokrovsk, which can cut off the final supply lines leading in and out of these cities. The more Ukrainian forces are able to withdraw from these cities, the faster the Russians will capture them, but again, the more Ukrainian soldiers will survive from the end of the battle. Although the withdrawal is the most deadly part of a battle, where in the Battle of Vovchansk, the ones who withdrew from the city, approximately 6 out of 10 were casualties that could not be recuperated from the withdrawal. That means that the Ukrainian forces that remains within Mirnorod and Pokrovsk and are now withdrawing from these cities will still suffer quite a bit of casualties from the withdrawal itself due to the operational encirclement of both cities. Russian reconnaissance drones are infiltrating all across the withdrawal routes, giving information to the Russian forces and striking them with FPV drones, artillery and FAB strikes, which have peaked at a level that surpasses that of the final days of the Battle of Avdiivka, where the Russians were bombing Avdiivka with approximately 150 FAB bombs a day, and now it is over 250. The Russians are simultaneously not letting the Ukrainians withdraw for free. They are already infiltrating the northern parts of Pokrovsk with their units, trying to gain as much control as possible along the highways to cut off the escape from the south as well. And at the same time, they've started storming Mirnorod as well from the eastern flank, where they're looking to gain control over the areas to force some Ukrainian forces to stay behind to slow down the Russian forces. Otherwise, the Russian forces will be able to overrun the Ukrainian positions and catch more and more of the Ukrainian soldiers before they are able to withdraw from these frontline positions. The Russians gained an additional foothold here in the eastern outskirts of Mirnorod, in the southern outskirts of it, where this geolocated footage confirms the Russian capture of not just Promin, but also the entry into Mirnorod, where they are fighting over the industrial area in the southern outskirts of the city. With this, the Russians have a foothold in the northeastern and southeastern outskirts of the southern parts of Mirnorod, where they are putting the industrial area in a pincer maneuver, gaining control over which will allow them to concentrate their forces towards the apartment complex area that separates the southern and northern parts of the city. And this capture over the industrial area will also allow the Russians to develop the offensive operations along the railway area up towards from Novhrodivka in the south to Pokrovsk in the north, allowing for additional supply lines into both Mirnorod and Pokrovsk in the central ports. This is also to cut off the Ukrainian positions south of Mirnorod in the Sukhyar and Lysivka directions, where the Ukrainians still have forward positions in the fortifications and settlements where they have been staying for months after over a year of fighting over Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. With this, we are at the final stretch over the battles over both of these cities, where the Russians have been fighting for over a year for both of these cities. They've captured half of Pokrovsk and they've gained a foothold within Mirnorod, but a withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from these two cities will significantly speed up the capture of what remains under Ukrainian control. Mirnorod was left all alone until the end, where they are simply trying to hold as many Ukrainian forces captured as possible, while pushing through Pokrovsk and Rudinsky on the northern and western flanks to completely encircle the city. As for Rudinsky on the northern flank, the Russians continue offensive operations from the north and the east, where in the northern direction they've captured additional streets of residential areas reaching the outskirts of the apartment complex area and the western outskirts of the city, and from the eastern direction they are advancing through the apartment complex area, pushing the Ukrainians out to the western outskirts, where the Russians are now attacking from the northern and eastern direction. Gaining control over what remains of the apartment complex area will allow the Russians to physically cut off the highway, push in the direction of the industrial area to the west of Rodinske, and to the south, where they can cut off physically the intersection from Hryshene in the west to Pokrovsk and Mynarad in the south. And this is the main danger that is likely promoting this withdrawal from Mynarad and Pokrovsk for the Ukrainian General Staff, and that is the fact that if this intersection is cut off by the Russian forces, then there will be no roads in and out of Pokrovsk and Mynarad. The Ukrainians would be forced to travel within a close proximity of Russian forces through the Dacha area into the northern parts of Pokrovsk, which the Russians have already infiltrated and cut off some of the roads into, which will then completely encircle Mynarad from all supplies, and all of the Ukrainian forces within Mynarad will be physically cut off. This means that a Russian push through to the northern parts of Pokrovsk through towards the intersection further south, with a combined strike from Rodinske in the north, will allow the Russians to physically encircle every Ukrainian soldier operating to the south of Pokrovsk and Mynarad, as well as all within Mynarad itself and the surrounding settlements on the northwestern flank. All of this would be physically completely encircled by the Russian forces. Not to mention the graveyard of vehicles in the intersection here to the north of Pokrovsk, which is already present due to the operational encirclement of these cities. Therefore, it is the logical decision to withdraw from both of these cities. The question is whether this withdrawal came too late, and the real question is why the Ukrainians bet everything on a counterattack on the flanks of Novotoretsk and Novoekonomishne, where they were looking to cut off the Russian grouping in the north, where in reality they do not nearly have enough forces to deal with the Russian positions in the area. It was overly ambitious and ended in failure, as the Russians held their positions in the north, restarted their offensive towards Rodinske, and consolidated positions within Pokrovsk, gained control over the Shakhtarsky district while the Ukrainians launched their counterattack. And we can see today, through this month of October, the results of the Ukrainian counterattack, and that is drying up their forces. When the Ukrainian counterattack first happened, they sent several brigades to the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Even the Azov forces were, until this day, we've really not heard anything from them. People were making fun of me, suggesting that a lot of them took casualties during the initial rotation, where the Russians struck their vehicles with FPV drones and ambushed their forces as they were disembarking from their transport vehicles. But we see the result of that today, despite the initial Ukrainian success by recapturing several settlements where the Russians were overstretched. Today we see the reality, and that is the Ukrainians are just a few weeks from the loss of Pokrovsk and Mynarad, which will completely overturn this section of the front line from one that is difficult to control to one that is completely in their favor, with Russian offensive operations being pushed towards Dobropilya, the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, and up towards the rear of the Slovyansk-Kostiantynivka line, which is a defensive line that is a mix of fortifications, trenches, and urban areas that have been built up for over the past 11 years, where the Ukrainians have been building fortification after fortification, defensive position after defensive position, and have a large concentration of forces and supplies for a long siege. That is the final battle of the Donetsk region that will take place starting once the Russians have captured Pokrovsk and Mynarad, pushed up towards Dobropilya and the rear of the Donetsk region to cut off all of the supply lines coming in from the western direction, limiting the supplies going into the Slovyansk-Kostiantynivka line to simply the railway going through Barvinkove in the north towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, and the highway through Izium towards Slovyansk in the north, both of which will be under threat once Russians capture the positions in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region and Liman in the north, to which the Slovyansk-Kostiantynivka line in its entirety will face operational encirclement similar to that of Pokrovsk and Mynarad. The reason for this is that we see that there are some fortifications on the vicinity of Pokrovsk, but once the Russians capture Dobropilya, then it is open fields all the way to the outskirts of the Donetsk region, which means that the Russian rate of advance will significantly increase in comparison to the fighting in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, not to mention that there are no longer any significant urbanized areas where there are any large cities or the sort within what remains of the Donetsk region in the western outskirts. The largest towns would be somewhere between 1,000 to 4,000 in population prior to the start of the war. Where in the Pokrovsk direction, the city of Pokrovsk had a pre-war population of approximately 60,000, Minorat approximately 50 or 40,000, and the several settlements in the vicinity such as Dobropilya, Rodinske, Ilitske, Selidove, Kurhove, and Novohrodivka all had thousands up towards 10, if not 20,000 pre-war population. So all of these were larger towns, smaller cities that all allowed the Ukrainians to have concentration of forces, FPV drone operators, and supplies that allowed them to stop the Russian advances. That is besides the fortifications that they had available, the defensive line around Kurhove, the defensive lines around Selidove. All of these were breached by the Russians over years of fighting, but now beyond that of Pokrovsk and Minorat, just minor fortifications and defensive positions and trenches are located along the border areas. All of this will become much easier for the Russians to push through than what has been fought over in the Donetsk region over the past 3 years. In the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians also managed to cut off some of the positions of the Ukrainians here in the Volodymyrivka direction by recapturing some of the positions and pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts of the settlement along the northernmost road. Fighting continues between the Russian and Ukrainian forces over the supplies going into Volodymyrivka, while the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainians on both the eastern and western flank of Shahove, looking to encircle the Ukrainian forces operating within the area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.